Welcome to Failure Upcycled. This is Dr. Vicki Stieha.
And this is Dr. Kimberly Henderson from Boise State University. In this podcast, we talk about the language of failure.
We share strategies for talking about failure and even not talking about failure. So let me tell you what I listened to both of the stories that we had available. One of them was the story of a girl who'd never failed at a class before, fails at a class that's required for her major, is surprised at the level of critical review on her material. There's a pattern here. We've seen this before. The teacher wasn't so good. The material was reviewed more critically than I thought it was going to be. I didn't count on the course being so challenging, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is not an unusual story. And in some ways, it's useful for this podcast because our students look back on courses like that and see it as a failure.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's great, but there's a pattern, right? And where can you go with it? And then we listen to the sports failure stories, right? I tried, I worked, I had everything, all my ducks in a row, and something didn't happen, right? And we didn't accomplish the end that we had in mind. I didn't accomplish the end that I had in mind. I didn't meet my goal. What I found interesting as I stepped back and thought about this story that Mario brings us is how do we choose to tell our stories after the fact?
Oh, yeah. The reconstruction, social reconstruction, all of that. Yeah.
Right. And so what is it about these stories when we ask for a story of failure that comes into play for people in terms of their social reconstruction of the story, and what can we learn from that? So I thought maybe we could explore that a little bit today. So what do you think is going on there?
It is hard to fail. I think it's hard to fail and just put that out there and say, boy, I just really messed up.
Yeah.
And it's just, I failed, but it's that conditional failure.
Yeah. So I think that it's hard to fail, and I think it's hard to talk about failure to other people.
Yes.
And what are the usually acceptable ways to talk about failure? Maybe one of the most socially acceptable ways to talk about failure is to talk about, but then I went back and I worked harder. But then, right, it's almost like a trope or the mythology of success is that if at first you don't succeed, try again.
Yeah.
So I think there's so much going on here with we've talked about Brene Brown, and she talks about this idea of the rumble, right? We rumble with our stories that we tell ourselves that are really negative.
Yeah.
She suggests that we have to rumble with those stories. And I think what I was really enjoying about revisiting Brene Brown and checking in with Susan David and this idea of emotional agility and tapping into the stories that we tell ourselves about our experiences, whether good or bad.
Yeah.
And one of the things that David says, it's not dealing with our emotions that gets us in trouble. It's these stories, right, that we assign to the emotions. It's the letting these experiences go by without saying, wait a second, what is that self-talk in my head?
Yeah. So I have a question for you.
Yes.
How or where do you see this fitting with that growth mindset? Like, so Brene Brown talks about like the shame story,
Mm-hmm.
right? You go around and you share the things that you just really, and that shame is that I believe that people see me as being less than because of the following things.
Right.
That you share those things and it kind of takes some of the toxicity out of them.
Right.
And then you get to the point where you do what we were just talking about, where you're able to reframe it. This skill of reframing and growth minds. I mean, how do you see those two things coming together? Or do you?
Growth mindset and reframing?
Yeah.
Obviously, I think that you need, maybe not obviously, I think you need to have what Dweck would call a growth mindset in order to reframe.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You need to be able to understand that there is nothing innately wrong or right that's necessarily explaining all of it.
Uh-huh.
Right?
Yeah.
That it's not our innate talent or our innate lack of talent or our innate intelligence or lack thereof that's important, but that it is an accurate, maybe optimistic retelling of what's going on, mm-hmm. that then empowers you as you move forward. I think whether it's Brene Brown or Davis or Dweck, I think all of these authors, all of these thinkers about mindset and about this narrative in our minds that has so much power over our perspective would tell us that we have to look at it. We have to see it for what it is, and we have to put it in the right place. We need to not allow it to have power over us, right? But to really address the story.
I think you're right. I mean, it's an action-oriented process, right? I mean, you have to tell the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you have to tell it. Like, you can internalize it all you want, but there's something about crossing that threshold when you share it with somebody else. There was a scientific study that was looking at rumination, right? Thinking about things. Oh yeah, there's lots of stuff on that. But what it was looking at, it was looking at what happens when people ruminate, right? Just turn things over in their own head, versus what happens when they actually go through the cathartic experience of just sharing it, right? And physiologically, what they've been able to identify, like through cortisol levels and sort of stress on the endocrine system, immune functioning, all that stuff, is that when we have a burden, right, like a shame story or a failure or guilt or any kind of sort of emotional, psychological suffering, and we share that with somebody, mm-hmm. the physiological consequences are lessened.
Yeah.
But when we turn it over in our own head, it doesn't lessen.
I think I remember this story.
Right?
Yeah,
like
this research.
It's one of those things that where, the idiom, I think, is like, a sadness shared is halved. Happiness shared is doubled, because then other people can feel happy for you, but they don't assume responsibility for your own sadness, or your disappointment, or whatever. And so I think it's really important to distinguish between like the reframing that can happen within ourselves, right? And I think we can do that with low currency events,
right?
And do well with that, right? So when you talk about, you need to think about what happened. Like, you need to take a reflective moment and just see what that really was for you. But that some of those things reach the point where they need to be shared. Like you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you can't get around it, you just have to go through it. And sometimes you just can't do it alone.
I totally agree. And I'm going to add one more thing to that.
Okay.
Because one of the tricky parts about the thing being shared is halved, is it has to be shared in the right way with the right person.
Yes.
So there's this idea also of collective rumination. So this is something that our students might think about when a friend comes to you and they're sharing this story about, something that didn't go well in class or something that didn't go well with a relationship. How do you answer that? How do you be in the right mindset, maybe
frame of mind.
Mind. Really, I don't want to overuse mindset, but how do you accept your friend's need to talk out loud and to address this narrative without contributing to the rumination?
So I'm old.
I'm older.
I know, but my birthday's tomorrow, so I'm feeling especially old. And I don't know if it's the product of age or what, but there are people that when I call them, I will start out and I will say, I just need you to listen. And then there are people that I call, and sometimes they're different people. Sometimes it's the same person, and they're really good about doing, different levels of commiseration. But then there are people that I call and I say, I have a problem. I need help finding a solution. Sometimes you call just because you want to, I was going to say, kvetch.
Yeah.
You just want to complain. You just want to put it out there. You just want to rah, and then you have those friends that you're like, damn right, let's go. I'm going to grab my torch and my pitchfork and we're going to go get them with you. You need that though.
Careful of that these days.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of torching and pitchforking.
Not literal, but.
No, nobody being literal. But we called it, one of the things my husband and I will talk about is being one another's echo mountain.
Oh, this is too cute. Okay, please explain. This sounds like a children's book.
Well, no, it's like, I just want to tell you this. I just want you to be hearing it and me to say it out loud and for it to echo back. So it's something in between ruminating myself and sharing it, because sometimes there's something that I know deep down inside, there's nothing that he can necessarily say to help me, to solve a problem.
Yes.
But I just want to say it out loud and get it outside of my head, where the echo will finally disperse. And having someone, even if they don't have the articulate solution or the training that's sometimes necessary to deal with some things that are really painful for us, especially failures.
Yeah.
To be able to just listen and absorb it.
Yeah. That talking, though, it's really powerful. Hearing yourself. And when you said Echo Mountain, I first thought sort of hearing yourself, like it was something you would say, and then the person would reverberate it back to you.
Yeah, and that's another technique.
Well, but then, that's still part of that, and then you can, and we do the same thing when we journal, right? We write it down, and then we wait a day, and we go back and we read it, and we're like, well, that wasn't actually what happened. That was just sort of maybe a little bit more of the space that I was in.
Right.
Right. You can have maybe a little bit more objective perspective of it.
Yeah.
Giving that space and that process.